Uncle Mark.
Yeah, shoot, man.
Having been locked up in our homes for all this time, I don't know if you know this. I personally, and you may too, I have a device in my house called a television.
Tell me more about this Fahrenheit apparat.
It utilizes the moving pictures.
Yeah.
And boy, howdy, I've been using the shit out of that thing.
Yeah, I'm surprised my TV just hasn't worn out.
Yeah.
Like an old shoe.
Yeah, exactly.
After a year in quarantine, that old question of what you would grab and if your house is on fire, I think has been answered for everyone.
Right.
Yeah, I need to take
Netflix. I will grab Netflix.
I need to take my TV to get resold.
Yeah. And speaking of Netflix, the number 2, I believe, thing on Netflix right now is something Doug's going to tell us about.
That's right. Well, dear uncles, we are but 3 lowly podcasters shouting inanities into the void once a week. And to my continued astonishment, there are people out there who not only listen to this drivel, but enjoy it. So,
suckers.
I know. What is up with you? So when we sink our tink our teeth or sink our teeth into meteor subjects, it may surprise our listeners that we sometimes put effort and thought into our segments. I don't often get to do victory laps, so I'm going to take the opportunity when it presents itself. A couple of weeks ago, Netflix released a 3-part documentary series on Mark Hoffman called Murder Among the Mormons, directed by Jared Hess and Taylor Meeson.
Tyler.
I'm so sorry, Tyler Meeson. I actually know him. I should get his name right. And like Uncle Dan said, it's doing quite well on Netflix. Longtime listeners will remember, however, that completely unrelated to the Netflix series, we did a deep dive into Mark Hoffman back in episode 136.
Yeah.
So when I heard about the series...
Scooped him.
Yeah, absolutely. When I heard about the series, I was both excited and nervous. Excited because I find the story endlessly fascinating, and nervous because I was sure I was about to get upstaged and embarrassed for my take on the saga. Here's the thing. I did like the series. I think it was very well done, well constructed and compelling, but, and this is what I want to talk about today, I really believe that we did a better, more thorough job of tackling this subject, which is a little strange because our segment was 38 minutes, while the series was 3 50-minute episodes. So you'd think that extended runtime would afford the filmmakers enough space to flesh out more context into this story, because in this story, context is everything.
Right.
Yeah,
I will say this, though. What you missed, and I think they really nailed, was footage of 1980s Salt Lake City.
I agree.
So I feel like you did a much poorer job of that.
And you never mentioned Mark Hoffman's sweet-ass Toyota sports car.
That's true.
Right?
I was showing a lot of that footage in my segment, but I don't know if you know this. This is an audio medium, so
man.
It was a lot of wasted time on my part. So let's talk a bit about some of the context and stuff that didn't make it into this, because I think it's pretty fascinating stuff. And they, in some cases, left it out, in some cases kind of glossed over it. So before we get going, and because no 38-minute podcast or 3-part docuseries could ever really get all of the context of this story, I will re-recommend Robert Lindsay's A Gathering of Saints, which is the definitive work on the Hoffman saga. And I'm sure the filmmakers borrowed heavily from that superb book. And so just a very, very minimal recap of the Hoffman story for those who didn't hear that episode or haven't watched it, and I'm going to keep it short. In Salt Lake City in 1985, Mark Hoffman, possibly the greatest forger in history, was on the verge of being discovered, so he killed 2 people with pipe bombs to try and buy himself some time, and then he blew up his own car with him in it. That's basically the story, with a lot more context, obviously. I do want to repeat this disclaimer from episode 136. Although Hoffman's forgeries were astounding, were and are, his techniques are next level, and his ability to separate fools from their money is unparalleled. Please do not mistake those truths for any kind of admiration or respect.
Or an endorsement.
Of course not. Yeah, Mark Hoffman was a liar and deceiver.
And a murderer.
And who stole tens of thousands of dollars from people that loved him, that he knew, therefore threatening their families and their livelihoods. And of course, like you said, Uncle Mark, he became a cold-blooded murderer who blew to pieces 2 innocent people for no other reason than to buy himself a couple days. He is a piece of shit.
He was also in a few pieces.
That's true. He did blow himself up unsuccessfully. So yeah, he's a piece of shit. I don't want anyone to think that I think anything differently. And And before we get going, I don't want to sound like I'm trying to dunk on the filmmakers or trash their work. Like I said, I really liked it. I've watched it twice. I happen to know Tyler, and Mark, I think you know Jared, or have you?
Not well.
Okay.
It's been a long time, but I'm acquainted with Jared, yeah.
Yeah, they're good guys.
Yeah.
If you don't know Hess's work, he directed Napoleon Dynamite and Nacho Libre, among other films.
Which makes him totally the right guy for a true crime documentary.
Yeah, it's a huge left turn.
There may be I don't know that there's anyone who kind of understands the subtleties of Mormon culture better than Jared Hess, though.
Well, there's that too.
Yeah. And there are some uncomfortable moments in Napoleon Dynamite that are a little too reminiscent of, our childhood or things we were familiar with.
My husband doesn't like it. He can't watch it because it said it was like a documentary about growing up in rural Idaho.
Hess is a Mormon, but that in no way means that as a filmmaker, he's not capable of tackling a subject that is less than kind to the Mormon Church. However, some of the lack of context left that taste in my mouth, and we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So let's start off with what I think they did very well. The production is slick and handsome. It's very watchable and engaging. I think the reenactments were very well done. The amount of archival footage they got was astounding. Like you said, Uncle Dan, just tons and tons of footage from the time and place. A lot of work went into the series, and it shows. Having so many of the players in this drama interviewed was very interesting. They scored interviews with great characters like local hero Ken Sanders, local weirdo Rod Decker, and colorful and pivotal characters in the story itself like Brent Ashworth, Kurt Bench, Alvin Rust, Brent Metcalf, and of course, Shannon Flynn.
Shannon Flynn was amazing in that movie.
He was such an interesting guy, wasn't he?
I mean, I had never heard of him before, which is weird because both my parents were church historians at the time, and so I had brushed sort of knees with a few of these people, but Shannon, the man who shows up to the interview in a 3-piece suit with a watch chain across his belly and then ends up talking about that time he owned an Uzi. That's a compelling character for me.
Yeah, he was very fascinating. I really don't know anything about him, but now I'm very interested.
Yeah, and he was kind of not calling him a bagman for Hoffman's not right. He helped Hoffman do what he was doing, unaware front to back that he was being duped, and he took a rap for it. Like, he got arrested.
Yeah,
and it turns out he had nothing to do with the forgeries or the murders. And they got interviews with some very tragic characters like Hoffman's ex-wife Dory Hoffman, who is so you really can't help but feel terribly, terribly bad for what she must have gone through in the context of all this. Hearing these people recount their experiences in their own words was very interesting, and it really personalized the story. And then, chillingly, in the third episode, you have the recorded voice of Hoffman himself dispassionately describing his forgeries and the murders. So that was pretty chilling and scary.
Yeah.
The series, especially in episode 1, correctly focuses on the White Salamander letter quite a bit, which was a forgery supposed to be written by a friend of Joseph Smith, Martin Harris. The letter describes Joseph's account of his spiritual guide being a white salamander, and goes on to describe that Joseph was involved in black magic and necromancy. So this is where I have my first criticism. Although it is discussed that this document could have been, was, and continues to be embarrassing for the church, there's not a lot of real discussion as to why, and why the church leaders were so apt to believe it.
Right.
Here's where I think the filmmakers kind of pulled their punches a little bit. Finding out that the founder of your religion had a hallucination about a white salamander is simply embarrassing, right? But there's so much more to it in the story of Joseph Smith. Smith was steeped in black magic, treasure hunting, glass-looking, divining, etc. So this letter wasn't even really surprising to church leaders. They have been hiding these facts about Joseph's early life for the entire history of the church.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the ultimate indictment. It's like, a lot of people online are, the church is this shows the church is innocent. They had nothing to do with this. And it's like, well, they thought there was a better than 50% possibility that this letter was real. Yeah.
Well, they fell completely for it because it sounded right. I can see that.
Yeah. It literally, it contradicted a few things in the sort of official story, but it really felt in keeping with all of the original sort of magic of the founding of the church.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that the belief that it was probable that it happened and that the rank and file Mormons would believe it was terrifying to the church. And and that context didn't really make it into the documentary, which I found a little surprising. Aside from the church's gullibility, it never really explored the church's motivations for purchasing this stuff and trying to keep it hidden.
Right. They weren't buying it because they wanted to display it prominently for all to see. Right. They were buying it to tuck it away in the mountainside and never, ever reveal it to anyone.
That's right. And the same is true of the McClellan collection and the 116 missing pages in the Book of Mormon written down by Martin Harris. I don't want to recount those documents here. Go back and listen to our segment for that. I would encourage that. But very little time was given in the series as to why these documents were potentially damaging. Just that they were.
That was a glaring omission.
Yeah. In the case of the former, the McClellan collection, it would cast Joseph Smith in even worse light. And in the latter, the 116 pages, it could almost certainly prove that the Book of Mormon was completely made up. So
either that or change what Mormons had to believe forever.
Right.
Yeah.
If they believed that it was actually like the missing sealed portion of the Book of Mormon, whatever it said would have to be then incorporated into their theology.
I never thought about that. If they found the 616 pages, they would have to put it in the Book of Mormon. Yeah. What else could they do? That's interesting. One very small criticism, although, and I don't want this one to take too much away from everything, but I do think it was a fascinating nugget that for some reason didn't make it in. Sandra Tanner was featured, and she's a lifelong enemy of the Mormon Church. She was featured, but it didn't talk about the fact that her late husband, Gerald, who was also a lifelong enemy of the Mormon Church, was the only person who doubted the authenticity of the Salamander letter. He had more reason to believe it or want it to be true than anyone, and he doubted it.
Interesting.
That's right. I remember they both found Hoffman very spooky.
Yeah, they found him spooky, and the white salamander letter was just too cute by half. So that's just a thing that didn't make it. That's very minor. My second real criticism of the series is that it portrayed the forensic document examiners, George Throckmorton and William Flynn, as basically having cracked the case by uncovering the forgeries. This is not the way it went down. As I was watching the series, Episode 2 climaxed with those two discovering microscopic cracks in the Hoffman documents that did not seem to exist in documents unrelated to Hoffman, and that this was the moment that they broke the case. So compelling was that moment that I started to doubt myself and worry that I would have to do another Doug Was Wrong segment. Now, the truth is that those guys did find those cracks, and I was tempted to talk about that part of the story back in our segment. But, some stuff had to hit the editing room floor. We all have to make our decisions.
Right.
But the cracks were not good enough to hold up in court and were not part of the charges against Hoffman. Any mediocre defense attorney would have made mincemeat of that evidence, right? Like, it's just too circumstantial. It's not provable. Anyway, the truth is the detectives Jerry Delia and Michael George were stalling in the case against Hoffman because of a lack of motive. They didn't know why Hoffman would do this thing. They thought he had done it, but they didn't have a motive.
And the thing is not the forgery, but the thing is the blowing people up. That's what they're after.
That's right. And because they weren't sure these things were forgeries yet.
They didn't have the juice for the forgery charges.
That's right.
Or they didn't know if they should or shouldn't think of them as forgeries.
Right. So they're kind of stalling in the case, and that's when the actual real McClellan collection was discovered in Texas. So Hoffman didn't believe it existed. He was in the process of forging it when it was actually found. This meant that one, Hoffman was peddling a fake document, that he was a fraud, and now you have motive, and that's when the case broke. So over the next...
Yeah, they didn't even mention the actual McClellan.
I know, that was very strange. So the case cracked through that set of events, not through the discovery of those tiny cracks in the ink. Over the next few years, and based on Hoffman's confession, all his techniques were eventually recreated. And this was actually one of my favorite parts of the series, is they were kind of reenacting his various ingenious techniques. Of using,
just a couple of them, though. I wanted more.
I did too, but I mean, like using a vacuum cleaner to pull the ink through the paper, and using that electrical current to create ozone to expose the documents to that. Fascinating stuff. But he got away with all of that, right? He got caught for the murders and then for being discovered to have done that. It was old-fashioned police work and random chance that broke the case, not the forensic scientist. That was my biggest beef. It was like, hey, this feels a little like they're rewriting their mistake. But hey, that's me.
Yeah.
And to my last criticism, and one that, again, may have been motivated by a desire not to make the church look kooky, we'll never know. Part of the plea deal with Hoffman was that he had to confess all his crimes so he could avoid the death penalty. Both his family and the victims had to accept this plea. Hoffman's father, if you'll remember, at first refused the plea deal because if his son had committed the crimes, his only potential path to forgiveness was to have his blood literally spilled on the ground by being killed by a firing squad.
Yeah.
Which was a form of capital punishment still in use in the 1980s.
Right.
This was adherence to the Mormon belief of blood atonement that Uncle Mark talked about in episode 50. So one of the weirdest and most interesting turns in the entire story, that the prosecution and the defense team had to go to the Mormon church to have them convince Hoffman's father not to have his son shot, didn't make it into the series. I thought that omission was kind of baffling.
Yeah.
That's crazy. Because like, Hoffman's dad was actually one of the very compelling characters that they kind of just glanced off of.
He didn't
he was like, we need to see more. We need to know more about this guy. Because he was clearly like part of the stew that created the psychopath.
Yeah, I think he probably traumatized Mark in ways that ended up, because Mark, of course, as we know from Doug's report, became a huge enemy of the church.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it would be interesting to explore that father-son pathology a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just to show that even now there is context to be explored, Uncle Mark sent me an article the other day written by a Mormon woman named Meg Conley, exploring one of the enduring mysteries of the whole Hoffman saga. How did Hoffman manage to keep his wife from ever entering the locked room in their house where he performed his forgeries, kept his paraphernalia, and eventually built his bombs? Conley's very interesting point is that Mormon women are basically trained to stay out of locked rooms.
Yeah.
The priesthood of the Mormon church is basically a locked room to all women, and Mormon women are constantly told to be obedient and subservient to their husbands. So for there to be a room in her own home that was off limits to her on her husband's orders would not actually be that unusual at all.
Right.
It wouldn't feel so beyond the pale that she couldn't just accept it and move on.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting. But so overall, I do recommend the series. I think it contributes a lot to the story, and it's very well made. But I do think it missed the mark a bit on why this whole thing really could not have happened in another time and place, due to the strange history of the Mormon church and the efforts of its leaders to keep things hidden, and Mark Hoffman's motivation to try and topple the whole thing. So,
and Uncle Mark's motivation.
Also, true.
I'm right there with him.
But if you do watch it and like it, might I recommend our segment? So I'm really pleased that we managed to pack into 38 minutes it felt like they weren't able to cover in 3 45-minute episodes, but yay us.
So like if you post about the Murder Among the Mormons, go ahead and recommend it to other people. Why not recommend our segment to everybody else?
Yeah,
they can hear.
Get us trending on Netflix.
So this is kind of the what underlies the entire enterprise here is I didn't know you knew the other filmmaker, Doug, and I haven't had any contact with Jared Hess in a very long time. He's a very funny guy, but I don't know what their current status vis-a-vis the church is.
Right,
and so I don't know if by omission or commission their prejudices, their particular feelings about the church made them want to protect it. If that's true, they probably never would have touched this as a subject.
Right.
Because this is just bad. This just makes the whole culture look kind of bad, right?
Right.
So, but wonder.
Certainly not as bad as it could have, because I think the more context you add in, the church comes out looking terrible. These are supposed to be prophets, seers, and revelators. They were duped. They were duped into purchasing stuff that's bananas because they thought it was true. That means they think, that means they have other. And there was, it's anecdotal.
It's because bananas is part of is cooked right into the cake there.
Yeah, truly enough.
Yeah,
and
that kind of folk magic was a completely believable reality for them.
And in their desperate attempt to seem less than crazy, they have tried very hard to hide the magical origins of the church from the public's view. That was motivating them to do this stuff. And so the deeper the dive, the worse the church looks. And I just felt like, again, I think it's well made. I don't think it did anything egregious. I think it's part of the tapestry, but it's not a complete, story about what happened. So there you go.
We not only did we scoop them and get to it before they did, we did a better job. I'm willing to accept it.
Tune in next week when we are going to review the Great British Baking Show.
That's right.
Which I've never watched, but people love it, so don't at me.
All right, let's move on.